So for this next session on advocacy for climate justice, we'll first hear from Karri Munn-Venn, who is a senior policy analyst here at Citizens for Public Justice, and she's the convener of the advocacy group for the Love of Creation. So she'll provide an overview of the advocacy goals and campaigns that have been engaged in so far. Then we'll hear from Sister Sue Wilson, Executive Director of the Office for Systemic Justice at the Federation of Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada. Sue will draw some connections between the theology and the advocacy work of For the Love of Creation. Then following that, we'll have three 10-minute presentations, one from Flossie Baker, who is the lead organizer for Sierra Club BC and the faith sector organizer for the Climate Emergency Unit. Also from Jennifer Preston, the Indigenous Rights Coordinator for Canadian Friends Service Committee, the Justice Arms of the Quakers. Jennifer participated in the UN working group that developed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and was involved in the intensive lobbying efforts to ensure the adoption of the declaration. And we'll hear also from Carol Thiessen, Senior Policy Advisor at the Canadian Foodgrains Bank based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She is responsible for heading up a multi-year advocacy project that urges the Canadian government to invest more in agricultural development in support of climate resilient food systems. So it should be another very good session that we're going to be participating in again. So over to you, Karri.
Thanks so much, Willard, and thanks everyone for being with us today and for these incredible conversations. 18 months to see so many people of faith, national churches, and faith-based organizations come together around a common set of climate advocacy goals. As For the Love of Creation, we've launched petitions, written letters to MPs and cabinet ministers, organized phone lobbies, and shared calls for the Government of Canada to take ambitious action towards climate justice. This year's Faith in Action campaign called on the Government of Canada to commit to reducing Canadian greenhouse gas emissions by 60% below 2005 levels by 2030, while investing in a just transition to a fair, inclusive, green economy that creates good, secure jobs and promotes the well-being of everyone in Canada. We also called on the Government of Canada to honor the rights of Indigenous peoples by implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including but not limited to the right of free, prior, and informed consent. And we called on the federal government to commit to providing equal support for climate change adaptation and mitigation measures in the global south through international climate financing mechanisms, scaling up to $1 billion per year. In a period of just 6 months, our engagement, along with that of many others across the Canadian social and environmental justice sector, created movement on all three of our policy asks. The progress made is significant and it must be acknowledged. At the same time, though, a huge gap remains between what Canada has committed to do, the actions that it is taking, and the scale of action that is actually required. We now have a new federal Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Steven Guilbeault, who built a career as an environmental activist. So there's a part of me that is just can't help but be tremendously hopeful that we have the right person in place to do the job. And as many have mentioned already today, COP26, the UN Climate Conference, starts tomorrow. So we know that this is a really important moment. As Willard said, Flossie, Jennifer, and Carol will talk about Canada's response to the climate emergency and also name what more needs to be done to really and truly achieve climate justice. First, though, who will situate this work in the context of our faith, drawing forward some of the key threads from the Letter of the Faithful. Sister Sue.
Thanks, Karri. And this really is just a quick effort to tie a few connecting threads between the Letter of the Faithful and the advocacy work that we're about to focus on. As we saw in the letter's calls to action, theological reflection flows necessarily into action. Otherwise, it loses its meaning. And likewise, faith perspectives motivate and deepen the meaning of our advocacy and action. So let me offer just 3 examples of synergy between the Letter of the Faithful and our policy priorities. First, in the letter, it's clear that the climate emergency is evoking strong feelings of fear and loss. The feelings are rooted in concerns for all life on Earth and for future generations. But they're also rooted in the awareness that political leaders around the world are not acting in accordance with the urgent timeline that scientists have set before us. So these concerns and this awareness of inadequate political action are the impetus behind the efforts at political advocacy. That's why we continue to push the government for steeper reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and for those investments in a just transition to a fair, inclusive green economy, which I'm sure we'll hear lots more about. Second, the letter is rooted in hope. Pointing to creation as the first revelation of God, the letter expresses a deep appreciation for the resilience of Earth's ecosystems. And as has been mentioned, it looks to Indigenous wisdom as a source for learning how to be in loving relationship with all creation. And finally, I would say the hope is grounded in a readiness to take action on many different levels. In our advocacy and action, we recognize that Canada and indeed our faith communities have a long way to go in learning to be in respectful and life-giving relations with Indigenous peoples. And so it is the priority to seek to follow Indigenous leadership in the wider work of defending rights, land, and water, and as we work for the full implementation of policies to fully uphold Indigenous rights. And third and last, the letter highlights a growing sense of the interconnectedness of all life, with each creature valued in itself and in all its relations, each one contributing in their own way. In our advocacy and action, one of the issues this interconnectedness impels us to take action on is climate financing. Given Canada's high levels of both historical emissions and per capita emissions, there's a clear ethical responsibility for Canada to ramp up our international climate financing and to lead on mobilizing all rich countries to provide stronger climate financing for developing countries to protect people and ecosystems. So as we listen to this afternoon's panelists and respondents, let's keep in mind that these 3 distinct but integrated paths for collective action are rooted in a much deeper vision of who we are and how we're in relationship with God, Earth, and each other.
Thank you, Sister Stu. I'm going to invite Flossie now, who's actually already landed in the UK, getting ready tomorrow. Over to you, Flossie.
Thank you so much, Karri, and thank you everyone for the invitation to say a few words today. It's inspiring to be with you all. I've just landed from Vancouver into London. I'm heading to Glasgow tomorrow for COP, and despite the jet lag, I've already found this event so inspiring and hope-filled. So thank you for having it at this very timely moment. Now is definitely the time to gather close and dream together. Karri asked me to say a few words about what I think constitutes an emergency level response to the climate crisis. I work for the Climate Emergency Unit, and we have a framework that helps us know if a government or an institution like a labour union or a faith organisation is in emergency mode. And I just want to share it with you because I have found it really helpful in my own advocacy, not only when preparing for meetings with decision makers and supporting others to do that, but also just to help get our imaginations going a bit about what an emergency level response actually looks like, because decades of neoliberalism has, after all, really, really hurt our imaginations. So firstly, an emergency level response means spending what it takes. A true crisis mindset is one that forces leaders out of austerity thinking. Secondly, an emergency level response creates new economic institutions to get the job done. So during the pandemic, we witnessed the federal government creating pretty audacious new economic programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy surprisingly quickly. Thirdly, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. At the beginning of the pandemic, again, we saw various provincial governments issue health orders to shut down non-essential parts of the economy. But for the climate crisis, we have seen virtually nothing of the sort. We tend to just encourage and incentivize and offer rebates and send price signals, but it's not enough. Fourthly, an emergency level response is one that leaves nobody behind. Any policy that doesn't support and protect the most vulnerable is not a climate emergency policy. And finally, it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis, not just in frequency, but also with unflinching honesty and optimism. A good friend of mine called Grace Nozek has been studying the tactics of the fossil fuel industry for years, and she keeps reminding me when I have a tendency to despair that one of their key tactics is to sow seeds of doubt. They put unbelievable amounts of money and time into playing up this narrative that things are just too far gone to keep trying, but that there is still so much hope, and we mustn't let them take it, because that's exactly what they want. So as Karri said, the new federal cabinet has just been announced, and these next 100 days are going to be absolutely crucial. And so we want to make sure that the new cabinet is hearing from faith leaders as much as possible. So if there is a minister who's in cabinet, who is from your province, please set up a meeting with them. If there's several faith leaders who on this call who are all in the same province, maybe try and set one up together. And in addition to that, we're also really encouraging people to set up a meeting with Krista Friedland. She's the Cabinet Minister for Finance, and we're asking that as many people meet with her, send her letters telling her that she must release the funds for a just transition immediately. Be as public as possible in these next 100 days and make sure that the public knows that the faith sector of this country expects nothing less than a full emergency response. And if you have a meeting, or if you're writing an op-ed, if you're prepping for a radio interview, please reach out to the Climate Emergency Unit or the Sierra Club of BC, and myself and my colleagues would just love to collaborate with you. There's also another answer that I would give to what it means to be in emergency mode, and it's already been alluded to so much today already. I hear over and over again from my Indigenous colleagues that the climate crisis is the result of the disruption of respectful relationships that happened through colonization. For those colleagues, there can be no lasting solution that doesn't restore those relationships. A lot of people say that the land back movement encapsulates a lot of this. Of vital importance then is the repairing of those relationships. And for myself, and I think for many settlers, that also means learning to be a better relative, a better neighbor to the water and the trees and the animals and the plants. And I think that actually means, and I definitely speak for myself when I say this, learning to slow down and not being so frantic and stuck in our heads involves learning how to listen, and it involves learning how to see differently. And it is slow and patient work. And I often hear things like, but there's not enough time, things are so urgent. But I truly believe that there is not time not to do it. And so it's really embracing this tension that I think is what is at the heart of what it means to be in emergency mode. Christina Andarotti is a professor of education at the University of British Columbia. She's from Brazil, and she often talks of a proverb that she grew up with, and it's this: in a situation of a flood, it's only when the water hits your bum that you can swim. Many political leaders, many well-off Canadians will only see what might be possible when the water gets to a certain height, possibilities that we couldn't when the water was only at our knees. In swimming, you have to have a relationship with the water. You have to have a different relationship to your breathing. You have to remember that you are mostly water. She says that we will be forced to reconnect with these capacities that modern capitalist society has tried to force us to forget. And in doing so, whole new possibilities will open up. And so ultimately, I think to be in emergency mode is to stand at the center of two circles, the middle of a Venn diagram between hospicing a world in which so many of its systems need to crumble and are crumbling, and midwifing a new one. To stand in the convergence of those circles is a confusing, exhausting, joy-filled, heartbreaking, transformative, and really beautiful place to be. And as people of faith, it's the place that we are called to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flossie. I'm going to pass things over now to Jennifer.
Thank you for that. And thank you for inviting me to be here with you for this panel today. I am a settler woman, and I'm coming to you today from traditional Anishinaabe territory in southwestern Ontario. I'm the daughter of Richard and Sarah Preston and the mother of Sarah Jane Howe. The Love of Creation really has this overarching focus on climate justice, but when Karri had reached out to me in the summertime and asked me if I'd participate in the conference today, she said, I'd really like you to come and talk about your work in advocacy work of partnering with Indigenous peoples on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is my area of work that I've done for many decades. And so that's the focus of my short presentation here. And it is widely understood, of course, that the focus on climate justice has to be tied to the intersections of the respect for Indigenous peoples' human rights, and that Indigenous peoples around the globe are already the most affected by climate change, and certainly will continue to be the most affected by climate change. They're already, in many parts of the world, facing the most severe impacts. And also, it's widely understood that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge have much to offer in the discussions around healing in the current climate crisis. So I would say that in our commitment to climate crisis, we must have a commitment to Indigenous peoples' human rights. So I'm going to speak briefly about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the federal legislation that was recently passed in Canada to implement the declaration, and how people of faith can continue to engage in advocacy and support of this work and of Indigenous peoples' human rights overall. In the interest of time, I'm going to give you a wildly brief history here, just that Indigenous peoples had worked from around the globe, all corners of the earth, had come together to work for more than 2 decades to develop the UN Declaration through 2 different working groups at the UN in Geneva, which makes it the longest discussed instrument in the history of the UN. And another unique feature is, and it is to date, the only human rights instrument developed this way, where the rights holders themselves became participants in the consensus that the UN does their work with. So it wasn't just a consensus of member states. It was a consensus with member states and Indigenous peoples. And to address the UN rules, the working group became informal so that Indigenous peoples held the same space in those meetings that states did. This, of course, is one of the reasons why it took as long as it did to develop it, and also why it's known as a compromise instrument. And I think that the history of that advocacy by Indigenous peoples is an incredible story, has not yet been repeated. The declaration was adopted in 2007. You know, it's already 14 years ago, and that has not been repeated, even though Indigenous peoples are active in many international forums. That particular practice where that space was held has not yet been repeated. The declaration is not about creating new rights. It's not what it did. The declaration affirms inherent or pre-existing rights, and it builds also on existing international human rights law, which is articulated in a manner reflecting the ongoing challenges that Indigenous peoples face all over the globe. Again, it's widely understood Indigenous peoples are the most dispossessed around the globe, and their human rights are the most violated. And I'll just say that Quakers were involved in this work on the declaration since the beginning of this specific work at the UN, which was in the mid-1970s. And I have had the privilege of doing it for about 2 decades. And Quaker in Canada, our engagement with the declaration is part of our spiritual discipline. We also informally coordinate what is the Canadian Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the web address for that is declarationcoalition.ca, where we bring together, it's mainly Indigenous organizations and experts and some individuals, as well as a few human rights and faith organizations. And this includes Kairos as well. So, and this, the coalition is supporting Indigenous peoples in the advancement of the declaration in Canada. The coalition came together while the declaration was being developed, and we continue to work together on implementation. And I would say that, I think I can say with confidence, that the long-term work of that coalition contributed to the positive developments with the federal government and getting a commitment to and the development of federal legislation that was adopted earlier this year. And then I'd just like to say too, that the Declaration and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the connection there. So many faith houses and faith organizations came to the work of the UN Declaration because of the work that was done by the outstanding work that was done by the commissioners in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And when they released their principles of reconciliation in 2015, they called the declaration the framework for reconciliation. It was their first principle. So their first principle was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the framework for reconciliation at all levels and across all sectors of Canadian society. So I don't think they could have been any clearer than that. And later, when they released their calls to action, there's many references to the declaration in the calls to action, but calls to action 43 and 44 specifically point to governments, the need for governments to be implementing the declaration and the need for the federal government to develop a national action plan. So of course it took 6 years from that point to the point of actually adopting federal legislation, including a commitment to a national action plan. And I'm sure that some of you were involved and remember supporting the work of Cree Member of Parliament Romeo Saganash and Romeo's tireless work to try and achieve legislation on the declaration. He had 2 different private members' bills. The second, more widely known, C-262, which was adopted in the House of Commons, very unusual for a private member's bill, and was devastatingly lost in the Senate after procedural strategies to derail that legislation. And when the House rose, there was a commitment by the government that if they returned to form the government, that they would introduce legislation built on 262. And so, of course, that is what happened. And in December of 2020, the Justice Minister, the Honorable David Lametti, introduced Bill C-15. Bill C-15, which had been developed using 262 as a base and through engagement with Indigenous organizations and leadership across the country. And much of the additional language in C-15 that strengthened 262 was actually drafted by Indigenous leadership and Indigenous organizations. So I don't have time here to go through all the nitty gritty, but that bill as a government bill did not get lost in the Senate, although we certainly went through enough trials and tribulations to get ourselves there. But C-15 did become law in June of 2021. So this is a momentous occasion, right? It took more than a decade to get this piece of legislation. Legislation can be achieved. We've seen legislation achieved in incredibly short periods of time. So it took us more than a decade from the time that Romeo started his work to the time that we got this federal legislation. And I remind you, more than 2 decades to get the declaration itself at the UN. This is not short-term work. So Faith in the Declaration is an informal coalition that many faith houses have been part of. And many faith organizations came together originally during Romeo's time and during Romeo's work to support 262. There was a big response from faith houses in supporting 262. And so we came back together to support C-15. We had a meeting with David Lametti. Faith leaders across the country met with David Lametti to share with him our support of the legislation and ask questions, both about process and content. And we do have a website. I think it's maybe in the chat, faithinthedeclaration.ca, I believe is what it is, where we've produced various resources and educational presentations. And we did a couple of webinars, and one of those webinars being we managed to have the 3 commissioners of the TRC to speak about the legislation. And that was one of the very first times the 3 of them had done a public event together since the time of the closing events in 2015, because of how committed they are to seeing the implementation of the declaration as the roadmap for reconciliation in Canada. And now I just wanted to say, you know, so why did the Quakers get involved in this in the first place? Why have faith bodies been championing this work for implementation? And I would say, you know, as people of faith, we are committed to peace and justice. You know, for Friends, we're a historic peace church. But we also, it's more than just having a commitment to justice. We recognize the injustice that we have been an active part of, and we've made a commitment to change. So we've made, and many have formalized this commitment, we've made this commitment to the deconstruction of the power structures that continue to oppress Indigenous peoples and continue to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands. And so if we are committed to that, to that deconstruction, then really we have to be committed to this work of implementing Indigenous peoples' human rights. So what's next? Where are we taking this? The election's behind us.
We'll just need to wrap it up as quickly as we can,
Yep.
Jennifer. Sorry.
Yep. The election's behind us, and we have a new parliament about to begin its work. And part of that work is a national action plan. Again, I would say, particularly with our coalition, the Faith in the Declaration Coalition, will be working to follow Indigenous people's lead in that work on the National Action Plan. So we'll see that work advancing. And I would also say that it's really useful for people in their own communities, in their own faith houses, and this is my last point, is to find and engage with projects that Indigenous peoples are working on around sustainable development, around dealing with the implementation of the declaration, including free, prior, and informed consent, and following that work and supporting Indigenous peoples in the work that they are doing around the implementation of the declaration.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you much, Jennifer. Over to you, Carol.
All right, thank you so much. And I am going to actually take the opportunity to share my screen. All right. Thank you so much for having me here today. And thank you very much to Flossie and to Jennifer for the thoughtful, inspirational words that preceded mine. I'm actually standing in for my colleague Moeni Mutinda, who is our lead on climate change policy work, and has just arrived in Glasgow and didn't feel like she could make it today. So kudos to Flossie for staying up late after her travels. I'll try to do my best. And I am speaking from the perspective of the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. And so I thought I would do a quick introduction to who we are before talking a little bit about what we're doing in terms of advocacy. So we are rooted as the Foodgrains Bank in the belief that humankind is created in the image of God, and that it is God's desire that no person should go hungry. The availability of food and access to that food is fundamental to life itself. There is enough food in the world to feed everybody. And knowing that there is enough food, we can work towards this big vision by working together, as our vision suggests. You can see here a list of all of the member agencies of the Foodgrains Bank. These members collectively represent approximately 30 Christian denominations in Canada. So why are we speaking about food in a conversation around climate change? Despite plentiful food in the world, hunger is increasing in all regions of the world. This year, approximately 768 million people are experiencing chronic hunger. You can see that there is an expected huge leap in the number of food insecure people around the world this year. A lot of that is to do with COVID itself and the impacts of the economic and other constraints that were needed to be taken in dealing with COVID. But in the longer term, the red that you're seeing in this graph indicates about 5 years now, where after decades of progress, we have seen a reversal of some of that progress. And that is in large part linked to climate change and increases in natural disasters and so on, along with some other factors such as conflict, economic conditions, inequality and discrimination in the world, and so on. Hunger on the rise. Specifically around climate change, we're seeing already an increase. Should we not take the required action, we could expect to see an additional 180 million people experiencing hunger by 2050. Without the support for adaptation, without action on mitigation for long-term effect, this is the likely outcome. But it doesn't have to be so. At the G7 event in June, Prime Minister Trudeau made an announcement to announce Canada's next tranche of climate finance. And when we talk about climate finance, we're talking about the commitment and the obligation that developed countries make to developing countries to support developing countries in adapting to and mitigating climate change. And so Canada did promise a doubling of climate finance to 5.3 billion over the next 5 years. We've talked a little bit about, I think there's sort of this tension between hope and emergency, as Flossie, you mentioned. And I think we feel some hope in that number. There is a definite step forward. It's not as much as is required, but it is a really positive. A doubling is a positive next step for Canada. They also promised increased support for adaptation, which is a good thing. And the Prime Minister spoke to nature and nature-based solutions. So although he didn't specifically speak about food security and the need to address that in the context of climate change, he did speak to the importance of nature-based solutions. We understand those as being essentially working with nature to address societal challenges, providing benefits both for humankind, but also for nature and biodiversity. So for the Foodgrains Bank, as negotiators and countries arrive in Glasgow, we are really thinking about a very specific time-focused ask for COP itself from Canada. And we really would like our new ministers who are representing Canada at the COP in the national statement and in other events that they show up for to really indicate their support for an ambitious climate finance package that not just increases support for adaptation minimally, but it makes a commitment to at least 50% for mitigation. Not because mitigation is not important, mitigation is really important, but for small scale food producers who are not the cause of climate change themselves, they're living the impact of climate change in the changes in their seasons, in the unpredictability of weather patterns, on the increases in heat that are destroying their crops and so on. They're experiencing that right now. And so Canada really does need to do more to support adaptation going forward. We also want to see greater focus on needs of people who really are experiencing food insecurity. Small scale food producers, particularly women, need to be centered in climate finance decisions. They need Canada's support, and they need to be included as participants and leaders in determining their own solutions. Those who are most effective need to be part of the solution decision-making process and implementation themselves. Nature-based solutions applied across the landscape can build food production and resilience, can mitigate climate change, can enhance nature and biodiversity. Some examples include agricultural models that protect soils, integrate trees and other forms of biodiversity, use cover crops, and so on. These can increase food security while also protecting and building up ecosystems. Those are positive choices that Canada can make to support going forward. So what can you do in the short time as the COP is about to begin? This is both sort of a last chance to write a letter before COP begins, and also in many ways a first chance to write a letter to two new ministers. One, Stephen Guilbeault, as we all know, is not new to the issue, but certainly new to this particular portfolio in government. And the Honorable Harjit Sajjan as Minister for International Development is as new as could be, I think, to both the issues of international development and this portfolio itself. So I've shown a link on the screen to an online letter. I think somebody's going to put that into your chat as well, so that you can go directly to that link. That letter really includes the asks, as I've mentioned there. We are asking for Canada to really step up and show a real support. And that letter is really easy to follow, and you can make it your own. There's lots of opportunities for you to make that letter your own, and it will be sent to these two ministers as well as your member of parliament. Climate change does increase hunger. Canada has international obligations, but also a moral responsibility to support those who are most vulnerable to climate change. We do want Canada to really take action. Too often our governments make promises and don't follow through. And we, as many have said before, we don't have the time for promises without true, deep, meaningful action. We do want Canada to do its fair share effectively to empower and support those who experience hunger and other injustices in the global south in the face of climate change. And your voice does matter. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you to all three, Carol, Jennifer, Flossie, Sue. Thank you for input in this section. We've got questions, so do put them into the chat to Beth, and then we'll be collating them and being able to bring them forward here. So we've got one already to start with for Flossie. There was certainly appreciation is being expressed for your work on the Climate Emergency Unit and the points made in Seth Klein's book. So thank you for that. But the question is is the climate emergency unit fleshing out those ideas? Are they fleshing those ideas out further? What policies should be created? Similar to the pandemic, there was CERB, industries required to create PPE. So what are some of those requirements do you think that should be made for climate change?
Thank you so much. Well, if you have a meeting set up with the ministers, some things to really hit home for the solutions that we know already exist are ending immediate subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. It's kind of a no-brainer. And again, the government needs to hear it as much as possible in these first 100 days. Build thousands of new affordable housing units and make sure that those housing units do not run on fossil fuels. I did write this list because I knew that my jet lag brain wouldn't be able to remember. Implementing UNDRIP in its totality, pursuing a pretty audacious wealth tax on the richest in this country to help pay for the just transition. And yeah, as I said, there is like a lot of talk. I mean, maybe Karri, you can jump in to flesh this out more, but there's a lot of talk of like needing to implement a just transition policy. And right now it's kind of lots of different things that I just said. It hasn't been tied up into a nice neat bundle. And so as that conversation continues, we need to make sure that the funding is there, ready to go out of the gate. And that's why, yeah, along with the other cabinet ministers that have been mentioned, we think it's so important to make sure that Krista Freeland is hearing from the faith leaders in this country.
Excellent, good, thank you. Thank you.
And if you are having a meeting and you want to go through those steps in more detail, that's what me and my colleagues do all the time. We will help you plan how to present those asks in a way that the ministers will hopefully best be able to hear. We can frame it in the language of their mandate letters. There's no like getting in off the hook right now. Yeah,
excellent, good, thank you, thank you. A question for Jennifer. Sort of starts with a comment that the story of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is encouraging. And then the question is, to what extent has the role of power as expressed by rail blockades, for instance, to what extent did those kind of demonstrations play in the progress of the declaration? And then what does that say about advocacy on climate crisis? Does that inform us in that regard?
I would actually say that the rail blockades in support of the Wet'suwet'en people actually slowed down the legislation work. It created a bit of the legislation was due to be tabled sooner, and that created a bit of a stumbling block for the tabling of the legislation, and then we got COVID. So then the legislation really got delayed. So in fact, I would say it totally was yeah. In this particular instance, I would say that type of direct action didn't play any role with the legislation in any positive way. I am not saying that I think that that necessarily means that it never does, but I think that in this particular example, no, it wasn't useful.
Okay, well, thank you. Question for Carol. Could you explain, Carol, further what is the difference between adaptation and mitigation? And what is the current percent for adaptation in Canada's financing?
Thanks, Willard. I might have to quickly try to page through a report here to get that exact percentage. So adaptation really means helping people on the ground adapt to the changes they're already experiencing. So in, from my perspective as somebody working in food security, that may mean introducing new crops or new ways of farming, or flood barriers and protections for people. It might be early warning systems around weather. So all of these things aren't actually changing climate change itself. They're helping to prepare people to respond to those changes. That's an important activity that needs to happen and needs to be scaled up. Mitigation is actually slowing and climate change itself. So slowing greenhouse gas emissions, or essentially, the changes and the impacts and changes that we need to make in terms of our oil and gas industry, in our support for fossil fuels, and also supporting and allowing global countries in the global south to be able to develop in ways that are, using clean energy approaches and so on. So that's the mitigation side. Both are really important. We can't address long-term climate change without addressing mitigation, but we can't address the changes and the challenges that people are experiencing right now without also supporting adaptation. Now I need to try to figure out what the adaptation percentage is right now. I think it's around 30-35% for adaptation, but somebody please help me if you know exactly what it is most recently.
Okay, yeah, maybe we'll have somebody do some background search for you there quickly. Research.
I'll jump in as soon as I find.
But maybe before you go, Carol, Canada has doubled climate finance, but from an incredibly low amount. So, the question is, don't we recognize Canada has to offer $4 billion every year? So why hasn't CBC nor the Globe and Mail been reporting? They're reporting on COP26. Why haven't they mentioned our terrible shortfall, and who will correct them?
All right. Well, I can't answer exactly why CBC and Globe and Mail aren't reporting. Yes, Canada. So I put on a positive spin. Canada is making improvements in its climate finance. I think doubling was something that we could celebrate, certainly in the short term. Yes, Canada should do more. There is a commitment by developed countries to mobilize up to 100 billion. We know that actually that's too low in itself. It should be more than 100 billion. The developed countries haven't come close to reaching 100 billion. Canada did meet the commitment it made previously, but it was a low commitment. So it met its commitment. So we are welcoming the commitment that Canada has made now to double it. We do think that's an important step. It should be more. The coalitions that we're part of would suggest it should be something more along the line of 9 billion over the next 5 years, as opposed to 5.3. That would much more closely represent Canada's fair share. So we always, certainly in my organization, we work this sort of tension between what's a pragmatic next step that we can ask for, that we can expect to gain, and what's a more prophetic vision or a much stronger ask based on principles of justice and Canada's fair share and so on. And so I think both of those are important. And so that's where I'd say where we can say, yes, this is a good first step, and no, it's not enough.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. A question here to Jennifer. Given that we have a global ecological emergency and do not have decades to wait to figure this out, how can we help integrate Indigenous wisdom into the very decision-making around money, land use, fossil fuels? Because that has, so far, it's excluded Indigenous wisdom.
Yeah, thanks for that question. One of the things that is actually a very interesting development internationally is now in the framework around climate change. They have a platform, an Indigenous Peoples platform, which is it is a way of bringing Indigenous peoples and their voices into the actual international negotiations around the Convention on Climate Change. So in fact, that is happening. that there is a space for Indigenous people's voices in the international negotiations. And yes, no, it's true. But I also really appreciate Flossie's comment earlier about that we have to take the time that it takes. And I think that the spaces are, we see that the spaces are growing where Indigenous law, Indigenous government, Indigenous ways of seeing the world are being integrated in so many spaces. Whether it's through governments, whether it's through academics, universities, it's growing all the time. And I think also we're seeing Indigenous peoples playing a big role in the work that's at the United Nations level is under the banner of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And that's really about that sustainable development. Development that is increasing to the climate disaster is obviously not sustainable. So when we're looking at sustainable development and globally, Indigenous voices are being included in that work, as well as I said, at the COP, they have the framework for the platform for Indigenous peoples, which is an excellent example of bringing Indigenous voices into international negotiations.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. A question for Karri. Karri, what have been the attempts to encourage Canadian faith leaders to work together on advocacy for environmental justice?
Thank you. One of the things that's been really interesting is that part of what we've done with For the Love of Creation is to bring this network together. And part of the efforts have been around encouraging those staff people who work on social and ecological justice to engage their leadership, but also at key moments to bring people together around signing letters. So we have issued letters to Minister Freeland, to Minister Wilkinson as well when he was Environment and Climate Change Minister, that have gone from leaders of faith communities. One of the pieces that we're working on right now, and that will be a piece that will follow right after COP, is to invite Minister Guilbeault and potentially a couple of other key ministers to a letter with a group that will probably contain faith leaders and may also include some of those of us who are participating in COP over the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Sister Sue talked about how theology leads to action. And then it was sort of interesting. I kind of put that up against Jennifer, your almost a passing comment that was in sort of an engagement. You see that the Quakers see that as spiritual discipline. I'd love you to unpack that a bit more. Explain that as a spiritual discipline, because I think that's, yeah, and maybe Sue would, can have some comments on that. So I would love to hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah, so we Quakers have to do everything slightly differently. That's what we do. And so anyways, we have, when Quakers meet annually, there's minutes from our meetings, and sometimes if we have a minute that's of particular importance, we will engage with it in that manner. And then we may, if it is deemed so appropriate by the national body of Quakers, then that work can become what we call part of our spiritual discipline. So then it becomes, we are integrating that into our faith and practice, so that it is part of our theology, if you will, in terms of that our work and our support and our commitment to the UN Declaration. We have signaled that this is now part of our spiritual discipline, and we regard it as such.
Okay, Sue, any comments reflecting on sort of that theology leads to action, and that action is part of a spiritual discipline? That's a good way of framing. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I love that way of framing it. I think that, you know, the bottom line is it's a question of integrity. You know, spirituality is about how we understand ourselves to be in relationship with God, earth, with each other. And our theology reflects on that and tries to refine those understandings. But, you know, all of that really doesn't take us anywhere without the action, without the trying to live out those relationships in an authentic way. So yeah, I think spiritual discipline is just about trying to hold on to our authenticity there.
Yeah. Excellent, good. Okay, a question for Jennifer. Indigenous people, the comment is Indigenous people are not monolithic. And so one space at the table is not effective or reasonable. Who are the Indigenous traditional experts? How effective is their knowledge being translated into policy? Indigenous perspectives on the Canadian adoption of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples suggests it is one-sided and not the original intent. So as a faith representative advocate, what is Jennifer's view?
It's absolutely true that there is no one voice that speaks for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And in the work on, starting on the work with Romeo Saganash on legislation, on having federal legislation, one of the things Romeo did is he traveled the country more than once, meeting in town halls in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to bring different voices to that work. And then when the federal government agreed to do federal legislation again, they had the task of engaging with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. And of course, there is a process that the governments use in terms of meeting with political organizations, as well as in other organizations. And so that's really, that was really what was done there. And lots of perspectives were brought into the dialogue and the discussions around what the legislation would actually reflect. And so with the agreement that Romeo's original bill would be the basis for that. And so there was considerable input. The statistics are on the government, I think Justice's website, but it's considerable input by Indigenous organizations, leadership, community level. And so it was very widespread, that discussion. And I think that I would also say one of the interesting things from being able to do work at the UN, it's a fascinating, usually when there's, and this would be the same as, going into COP, there'll be an Indigenous caucus in the UN meetings where the thematic is very important to Indigenous peoples. And so there'll be a lot of Indigenous representatives there. They will have a place where they caucus, and that brings together Indigenous reps from around the globe, and including, dealing with lots of language challenges. But there's a space where they come together, where they can discuss issues. And, having an Indigenous caucus in Geneva was how they achieved the declaration itself, because they were able to bring all their perspectives together and find the space of the text that they were willing to support going forward.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for your input. Appreciate it very much. And thanks for your willingness to engage in these questions, further conversation. I very much appreciate that openness. Thanks for all the people that have given questions through the chat. I really, really appreciate that. So thank you. Thank you all.